Chapter 12. Logging in the High Lonesome, 1862 to 1949. The Big Picture. For thousands of years, people have used forests to fill many different needs. Montana's forest lands support our economy, our communities, our homes, and our lives. Forests have always been important to life in Montana. Have you ever sat under a tall pine tree, looked up at its branches sweeping the sky, and wondered what was happening when that tree first sprouted? Some trees in Montana are 300 or 400 years old, the oldest living creatures in the state. They rooted before horses came to the plains. Think of all that has happened within their lifespans. Trees and forests are a big part of life in Montana. They support our economy, employ our people, build our homes, protect our rivers, provide habitat for wildlife, influence politics, and give us beautiful places to play and be quiet. Forests can be recreational places of peace. Yet Montana's forest lands have also seen turmoil, struggles, strikes, and wildfires. Even today they lie at the center of nationwide arguments. The forests of Montana. 1/4 of Montana is forest land. Forests protect river drainages by helping retain water in the soil. They prevent erosion,
the wearing away of soil,
by keeping soil from washing away into the streams. They convert carbon dioxide into oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. They provide food and shelter for many kinds of wildlife. The 3 regions of Montana have different combinations of precipitation,
rain and snow,
average hot and cold temperatures, and growing season. Therefore, each region supports a slightly different kind of forest. Some trees, like ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, willow, and cottonwood, grow in all 3 regions. Nearly 75% of Montana's timber grows in the relatively moist western region, and logging is one of the most important industries in this region. The region also grows the widest variety of trees. The principal commercial species here are ponderosa pine, also called western yellow pine, Douglas fir, western larch, white pine, hemlock, western red cedar, spruce, and lodgepole pine. Central Montana is drier than the western region, yet its hills and mountains retain enough moisture and snowmelt to sustain scattered stands, called island forests, of ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, spruce, cottonwood, and aspen. Some logging occurs in the central region, but not as much as in the western region. The principal commercial species are ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and spruce. In the dry, windy eastern region, trees do not grow very fast. Pine and juniper grow along the rivers and streams. Lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir grow in thick stands on hillsides. The principal commercial species here are lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir. Some cottonwood and juniper is also cut for local use. Indian tribes managed forests with fire. The dense woodlands of western Montana did not always look as they do today. American Indians who lived in the forested areas used fire as a tool to shape their landscape. They set small blazes to clear underbrush, open trails, control insects, and encourage certain medicinal or food plants to grow. They sometimes set grassland fires to herd bison. They started these fires in the fall when it was cool and wet, so that the fires would not get too big. In the Salish and Pend d'Oreille traditions, the person in charge of the use of fire was called the Swapam. The Swapam passed his knowledge down from generation to generation. Trappers and missionaries coming to Montana in the early 1800s found many clearings of grassland and mountainsides lush with huckleberries. They saw very little underbrush in the park-like forests. Today, some elders on the Flathead Reservation say that their grandparents camped and gathered food in clearings that are now so densely forested you cannot even find their old trails. Under threat from the whites, Indian people stopped using fire. In November 1875, a group of Pend d'Oreille Indians crossed to the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains near the Canadian border for a bison hunt. They set a fire as part of their traditional practices. White law enforcement officers reacted in fear. They shot and killed 2 of the Pend d'Oreille men for setting the fire. After that, the tribe stopped setting fires, and dense forests covered much of western Montana from the valleys to the tree line.
The line above which trees do not grow.
Early timber harvesting. American Indians harvested timber for lodge poles, horse
Travois.
a transport device made of two joined poles and drawn by an animal, arrows, bows, bison pounds, corral-like enclosures used to trap bison, and other uses. Before metal tools arrived, they cut trees with stone mauls and choppers, and smoothed them with tools made of bone or antler. They harvested trees in the spring when the sap was running and bark was easy to remove. They also collected poles from burnt areas. Tree cutting was labor-intensive,
Requiring work and time.
so people stored poles near a campsite for later use when a group moved on. People from the forests often traded teepee poles made of fir, lodgepole pine, and red cedar to tribes farther east, where these trees did not grow. Lumber for trading posts and missions. Trappers and traders built log buildings. They cut planks for flooring, shed roofs, and wagons. They sawed planks from logs with a whip saw, the long, two-handled saw, also called a pit saw. When the Jesuit missionary Father Anthony Ravalli came to the Bitterroot Valley in the 1840s, he introduced the circular saw, a circular blade turned by water power from a stream. Father Ravalli did not have a circular blade, so he made his own by flattening out an iron-rimmed wagon wheel and cutting teeth into it. This water-powered mill was the first sawmill in Montana. Gold Rush. Suddenly, a world of need. In 1862 came the gold rush. Suddenly, people needed lumber for everything: sluice boxes, firewood, cabins, stores, wagons, and bridges. Anton Holter was one of the first to establish a sawmill to fill these needs. In 1862, he used ox wagons to haul his heavy equipment to the Ruby Valley near Virginia City. But when he unpacked, he realized he was missing several important parts. He was 500 miles from any machine shop or parts store. So, like Father Ravalli, he improvised.
Invented something on the spot.
He made a blacksmith's bellows out of his rubber coat, cut an untanned ox hide to make belts to turn his saw, and drove a broadaxe into a stump to serve as an anvil. With these homemade tools, he made the parts he needed. Montana's lumber industry followed the same boom and bust cycles.
Sudden economic activity followed by decline, then a period of quiet, and then another burst of activity.
That mining did. As placer mining boomed, demand for lumber boomed too, and prices remained high. Soon, dozens of small, steam-powered or water-powered lumber mills operated in many communities. But when placer mining slacked off, so did the demand for lumber. In the 1880s, everything boomed. When the railroads arrived in the 1880s, all of Montana's industries boomed.
See Chapter 9.
Railroads, mines, smelters, and towns all used enormous amounts of lumber. The railroads laid millions of ties beneath its tracks and used more timbers to brace tunnels and support trestles and bridges. Mines required millions of timbers to support miles of underground tunnels and shafts. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company used more than 200,000 board feet of timber every day in its mines. Early Butte smelters burned thousands of cords of wood per day in a process called heap roasting. It was the first step toward transforming ore, which is rock containing precious metals, into copper. Workers laid timbers over an area about the size of a city block. Then they poured a layer of copper ore over the wood. They stacked up layers of wood and ore until they had a heap 6 or 7 feet tall. Then they lit the heap on fire and let it burn for days, filling the air with toxic haze. Later, smelters used unimaginable amounts of lumber to build buildings and water flumes,
Channels.
and to operate the smelter. In 1888, the Anaconda Company burned nearly 1,000 cords of wood every day in its smelter. Meanwhile, people built towns, houses, barns, fences, and chicken coops all across the region. By 1890, more than 100 lumber mills, producing 130 million board feet of lumber per year, could hardly fill the demand. That year, the value of Montana's lumber nearly equaled the value of its gold and silver output. 3 industries form a powerful triangle. No one in Montana used more lumber than the copper interests and the railroads. It did not take long for mine and railroad owners to invest in their own lumber companies so they could control price and supply. In the 1880s, Marcus Daly, who owned the Anaconda Company and the Northern Pacific Railroad, bought up several small lumber companies and created the Montana Improvement Company. These 3 companies formed a powerful corporate triangle. They were run by just a few men, and they employed more workers, made more money, owned more land, and controlled more transportation routes than anyone else in the entire region. The copper and railroad interests already dominated the largest sectors of Montana's economy. Now they were even more powerful, and sometimes they acted as if they were above the law. Stealing timber or developing a frontier. The tremendous need for wood drove lumber companies to cut trees wherever they could. The Montana Improvement Company was the most aggressive. It cut trees on millions of acres of land owned by the Northern Pacific Railroad. Then it began cutting timber illegally on public land and on the Flathead Indian Reservation. In 1885, the government sued the Montana Improvement Company, saying it had illegally cut $600,000,
almost $13 million in today's dollars,
worth of timber in 1885 alone. But Marcus Daly, who ran the Anaconda Company and was part owner of the Montana Improvement Company, told Congress that if it stopped the illegal logging, 10,000 Montanans would lose their jobs. The Northern Pacific Railroad, another part owner of the Montana Improvement Company, used its power to gain the support of Montana's territorial governor. In addition to being governor, Samuel T. Hauser owned a bank. The Northern Pacific said it would take all its money out of Hauser's bank if he did not oppose the federal government's lawsuits. The lawsuits went on for years, and so did the illegal timber cutting. Logging on the reservations. In 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad laid tracks through the southern end of the Flathead Reservation. The railroad agreed to pay the tribes cash and cut only as much timber as it paid for. But once timber cutting began, it was hard to manage. Lumber companies logged and milled at a furious pace. It was hard to enforce any rules at all. By this time, the Salish and Kootenai were already frustrated by timber policies on the reservation.
Land the tribes had reserved for their own use through treaties.
Throughout the early reservation years, government agents sold off tribally owned timber to pay reservation expenses that the government, under treaty with the tribes, should have paid for. In the 1860s, the Flathead Reservation agent had purchased sawmill equipment with tribal funds, but had located the mill far from where the Indians lived, so they rarely got a chance to use it. On several of Montana's timbered reservations, the government allowed settlers to cut reservation timber for their own use. Settlers trespassed onto reservation lands, cut down trees, and set up sawmills to cut lumber. They did not think the Indians had any use for their timber, so they did not see it as stealing. Over time, the tribes developed their own lumber industries on their reservations. During the 1900s, Montana's Indian tribes regained some control over their forest lands. The reservations became important sources of lumber for the U.S. military during World War II. After the war, America's housing market boomed.
See Chapter 20.
Logging and milling became an even more important economic activity for the tribes. Over the past 50 years, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have developed a forest management program that has become a model for other regions across the country. They also became the first Indian nation in the country to designate a wilderness area when they created the Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness in 1979. Timber also feeds the economies of the Blackfeet, Rocky Boys, Fort Belknap, Crow, and Northern Cheyenne reservations. For example, timber covers nearly 1/3 of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Logging and lumber milling employ more Northern Cheyenne people than any other single industry. The work of the lumberjack. The life of an early lumberjack was difficult and dangerous. Men who cut down the trees were called
fallers
or sawyers. Sawyers first cut a notch in one side of the tree to control the direction of its fall. Then they sawed through the base of the tree using a 2-man cross-cut saw, sometimes called a misery whip, because if it was not filed just right, it made a man's work miserable. After the sawyers felled a tree, other men delimbed it with a double-headed axe. Another team would transport the logs to a river by horse-drawn wagon or later by train. Sometimes they built a V-shaped chute down a hillside and sent the logs down it like torpedoes. They stacked the logs by the river until spring, when the water ran high, and then floated the logs downriver in a river drive to the sawmill.
See how it worked at the end of this chapter.
Lumberjacks first cut trees where it was easiest, around mills, near roads, and along the rivers nearest the settlements. Soon the hills around every town were bare of trees. Woodcutters had to travel farther to get timber. Some lumber companies built railroad tracks into heavily timbered areas. They used powerful locomotives that could climb steep slopes, fully loaded with logs. The locomotives could work in weather too hard on animals. Logging trains allowed the mills to stay open for more of the year to fill the increasing demand. After 1913, some loggers began using steam donkeys. Steam donkeys were steam-powered engines with a 100-ton winch that could mechanically haul logs through the brush to a road or railroad car. Steam donkeys made logging easier, especially when it was too icy or snowy for the animals to work. The 1920s brought gasoline-powered tractors, trucks, and other vehicles. Loggers cleared brush and built roads with bulldozers and stacked logs with cranes. Soon, gas-powered logging trucks took over, and logging railroads became things of the past. Lumber milling becomes more mechanized. The first sawmills ran on water power and produced rough, green,
not dried
planks for buildings, sluice boxes, and mines. Early sawmills operated only in the warm seasons when the rivers ran, because the mills depended on the river to float logs and power the mills. When the mill had sawed all the logs from that year's river drive, it shut down until the following spring. As the lumber industry developed, milling became more efficient and more mechanized,
with machines doing work previously done by people or animals.
The mills replaced the huge circular saws with band saws, saws made of a continuous toothed steel band looped over 2 wheels, which could cut larger logs. Over time, the mills developed chain rigs, pulleys, ramps, and other mechanical devices to lift and move logs. Specialized equipment produced finished lumber, shingles, window sashes and doors, wooden boxes, and lath, which are thin, flat strips of wood used beneath plastering. Life in a logging camp. Dangerous, exhausting, and lonely. That is how workers described life in a logging camp in the late 1800s. Lumberjacks woke before daylight, ate a breakfast of hard-fried eggs, some called them crackleberries, and hiked to the work site, arriving at first light. They labored 12 to 14 hours a day in extreme heat or freezing cold, amid mosquitoes and a constant danger. Then they hiked back to camp for a huge supper of pork fat, beans, and whatever else was available. Men bunked 30 or more to a bunkhouse, and often 2 to a bed. They had no bathrooms and no showers, and they dressed in the same smelly, wet clothes every day. Loggers working deep in the woods lived far away from their families. They sometimes went weeks without mail. Some moved from camp to camp throughout the Northwest, and seldom spent any time in town. Some men were known only by nicknames, such as Wood-em-up George or Moonlight Joe. One hears little of laughter and jokes in a logging camp, wrote early forester
Ehlers Koch.
Men eat their enormous meals silently and sit in the bunkhouse or outside them, tired from the heavy work that goes with the job of manhandling big logs. Swinging axes, felling trees, balancing on rolling logs, and riding a river drive made very dangerous work for lumberjacks. Logs could crush them, falling branches could kill them, and saws and axes could maim and injure. On river drives, they could be squashed between floating logs. In wintertime, their hands and feet froze. Discomfort and danger were the loggers' constant companions. Loggers protest working conditions. 3 interconnected trends changed life in the United States in the early 1900s. Industrialization, which is the creation of factories, urbanization, which is the growth of cities, and immigration.
People moving to a new country.
These trends all affected the timber industry. For example, industrialization attracted new immigrants. This caused America's cities to grow quickly after 1900. The growth of cities dramatically increased the demand for lumber. Not all of the new immigrants settled in cities, and many of them were desperate for jobs. Some became bindlestiffs, which were migrant lumber workers who carried their bedrolls on their backs. These men traveled from logging camp to logging camp looking for work. Many of them did not speak English very well. All of them were willing to risk serious injury for low wages. Some lumber companies treated these workers almost like slaves. In some places, employment agents recruited men by the thousands with bright promises of good jobs. But to get those jobs, they had to pay an employment fee, $1 for the hospital, and other charges. Sometimes they would work just long enough to pay off the fees before getting fired. A man could work several days and receive a paycheck of 5 cents. Into the logging camps came union organizers from the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, also called the Wobblies. They drew support with slogans like "Workers of the World Unite" and "An injury to one is an injury to all." It was not easy for loggers to organize into labor unions, which are organizations of employees that bargain with employers, because they were spread far apart in remote areas and their employers were so powerful. But as conditions got worse, loggers and sawmill workers listened to the Wobblies. In March 1917, lumbermen in Montana and the Pacific Northwest formed an IWW union. In April, they called a strike.
An organized protest in which workers refused to work.
Against the Eureka Lumber Company in Lincoln County. The union demanded higher wages, 8-hour workdays, no work on Sundays, better meals, and other improvements like showers and beds with springs. The strike spread across the Northwest. Loggers from Montana to Seattle refused to cut trees until they got what they asked for. Mill owners and their corporate partners did not want to give in to the union's demands. They wanted to crush the Union. America had just joined World War I against Germany.
See Chapter 16.
Corporate owners claimed that the Wobblies were enemies of American industry and that the strike would hurt the war effort. They turned public opinion against the Wobblies. The government called in military soldiers to end the strike. Armed troops raided Union meeting halls across the Northwest, arrested Union leaders, and charged the leaders with sedition, which is speech or conduct that encourages rebellion against the government. Even though the government stopped the loggers' strike, it did agree to investigate their complaints. These investigations showed that strikers had good reasons for striking. The owners of Montana's lumber companies began to negotiate with the loggers and compromised on wages, logging camp conditions, and an 8-hour workday. The idea of conservation emerges. Meanwhile, people around the United States began to realize that too much logging threatened the nation's forests. Already, vast forest lands from the Great Lakes to California had been logged to bare soil. Americans began pressuring the government to manage forests more carefully. 2 ideas emerged at this time. The first was preservation.
Preserving something from destruction.
A movement began to preserve the nation's natural wonders by creating national parks. The second idea was conservation, which is reducing the use of something to make it last a long time. The government conserved public forest lands for long-term use by creating national forests. In the national forests, the government controlled how much timber could be cut at one time. Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act in 1891. It created 15 forest reserves, which the government managed for long-term conservation. The Forest Reserve Act stated that grazing and timber cutting in these areas was a privilege, but not a right. Private companies could log on the forest reserves, but they had to get permission and follow certain rules. Lumbermen, miners, and cattle and sheep ranchers in the West protested the forest reserves. They wanted to use the natural resources of the West as they saw fit. They had different goals from those of national leaders in the faraway East. Many of these conflicts continue today. Birth of the U.S. Forest Service. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt created the U.S. Forest Service. The 15 forest reserves became part of the National Forest System. National forests are managed both for their beauty and for their economic value. They work as a kind of savings account of trees, grazing lands, minerals, and other resources that the government protects for the long term. So today, national forests permit people to graze livestock, harvest timber, hunt animals, mine minerals, and collect mushrooms, berries, firewood, and Christmas trees if they get permits and follow the rules. This is called managing for multiple uses. State forests help pay for your school. States set aside forests too, but state forests are used in a different way than national forests. Montana's 8 state forests are part of an enormous 5.1 million acre land trust owned by the state. A land trust is a kind of savings account set up to benefit the people of Montana. The state earns money by selling and leasing trust lands and by selling timber on the state forest lands. The money that is earned goes to benefit Montana's public schools and other important institutions like the Montana Veterans Home. So the next time you drive through one of Montana's state forests, think about your school. Fire. Fire is nature's way of renewing forests. Fires clean out diseased and dead wood, clear underbrush from the forest floor, and help new trees to grow. Fire can also destroy homes, businesses, and trees that could be used for lumber. Up until 1910, however, the government did little to prevent forest fires. The Great Fire of 1910 was a turning point. The summer of 1910 was the driest summer anyone could remember. The woods were so dry, they crackled. Hundreds of little forest fires ignited across western Montana. Suddenly, on August 20th, a fierce wind came up and whipped all the little fires into one immense wildfire. It generated hurricane-force winds and tore across 3 million acres of timberland in 2 days. It killed 86 people, destroyed 5 whole towns in western Montana, Sylvanite, Taft, DeBorgia, Hagen, and Tuscor, and terrified everyone. The Northern Pacific and the Milwaukee Road sent trains to rescue townspeople in the area. The trains raced through fire so close that it blistered the paint off the locomotives. One of the trains just made it across a wooden trestle before the fire burned it up. 10,000 men came to help local lumbermen fight the fire, including Butte miners, Idaho loggers, Washington farmers, Indian firefighters from many tribes, and an all-black regiment of the U.S. Army's Company G. Finally, an early September snowfall put out the fire. If you visit the Kootenai National Forest today, you can see blackened snags, which are standing dead trees, from the 1910 fire. After the Inferno, developing ways to fight forest fires. The Great Fire of 1910 shocked people into action. Never again did the American public want to be unprepared for a major forest fire. People urged the government to protect forests from fires. The U.S. Forest Service, and later other agencies, began programs to develop new firefighting equipment and techniques. The Forest Service also began a massive program to build trails and roads on the national forests to give firefighters better access into the forests. Lumber companies organized into forestry associations that worked with the government to prevent and fight wildfires. Firefighting created a new industry in Montana with new dangers. Firefighters were sometimes killed by burnovers, which are fires that overtake firefighters or their equipment, in plane crashes, by falling trees, or by heart attack from extreme exertion in the heat. The most devastating example of this was the 1949 Man Gulch fire near Helena. 13 firefighters died when the fire they were fighting raced up a steep slope and overtook them. The Man Gulch fire was a tragedy that affected the Forest Service for years to come. It taught firefighters many things about fire behavior, and fire experts continue to study it to this day. After many years of fire suppression,
stopping or limiting something,
forests grew more unhealthy. Without regular fires, brush grew thickly on forest floors. Dead trees increased. Decayed leaves, branches, and tree trunks covered the ground. The forests became more vulnerable to catastrophic fire because fires burn hotter and spread more quickly when there is a lot of brush than they do in a healthy forest. This unnatural state led to devastating fires at the end of the 20th century. The lumber industry in the 20th century. After expanding so rapidly in the late 1800s, Montana's lumber business went through several big changes in the 1900s. It followed the same ups and downs as the construction industry, which expanded and contracted with the overall economy. In the 1920s, drought brought economic collapse to Montana. Then, in the 1930s, came the Great Depression and almost a decade of economic hardship across the country. People did not have the money to build new homes and buildings.
See Chapter 18.
The timber industry declined. Then came World War II. The military needed lumber to build barracks, crates, and thousands of other military supplies. The lumber business boomed again. By 1948, Montana had 434 lumber mills. Along with board lumber, they produced new building products like plywood and particle board.
Panels made of wood fibers glued together.
Montana also began raising, selling, and shipping across the country one special product imported in many houses every year: Christmas trees. The land gives many gifts. Forests have been important to Montanans for thousands of years. How people have used the forests has changed over time. So has people's understanding of forest fires. What has not changed is how much humans need forests for firewood, shelter, food, and beauty. Today there are trees standing in Montana's forests that have lived through 400 years of history. There are also saplings,
young trees,
just now starting to grow, that will tower over the people living here 400 years from now. The decisions we make today about forest management will shape the lives of those trees and affect the lives of those people far in the future.
How it worked. Log chutes and river drives. Cutting trees was the easy part. Moving enormous logs to the sawmill was tougher. In the days before trucks and machinery, the easiest way to get logs off the mountain was to build chutes and let gravity do the work. Loggers built chutes that sometimes stretched for miles down a hillside. Then a greaser slathered thick grease onto the sides of the chute with a wooden paddle to make the log slide better. As lumberman Mark Watkins said, the greaser had to keep alert as the logs traveled at high speeds and would sometimes jump the chute at the curves. In the winter, they poured water over the chute to freeze, making it even more slippery. If building a chute was not possible, then men used horse teams to drag logs out of the woods to a riverbank or roadside for transport to the mill. This worked best in wintertime when snow or ice helped the loads to slide along. Young men called sand monkeys spread sand or ashes on icy tracks to keep the heavy loads of logs from overtaking the teams of horses. The best way to get logs to the sawmill was to float them down a river. A river drive was a spectacular sight. Men called river pigs drove thousands of enormous logs down Montana's waterways, leaping from log to log with the skill and balance of dancers. They prodded logs with a peavey, a spiked iron pole, to keep them from jamming. A log jam could be disastrous. A bad jam could pitch logs into the air and could easily squash workers. When log jams did occur, the backed-up river created tremendous pressure behind the jam. It took skilled river pigs to find the key logs to release a jam, dislodge them, and get out of the way fast. River drives were late spring and early summer events, when the waters ran high. In wintertime, loggers banked huge stacks of logs by the riverbank to wait for the spring thaw when the river drive could begin.